Hello, and welcome to the 100th installment of KRAD COVID Readings. I started this a year and a half ago as a way to entertain people during lockdown, and it kind of grew. I gotta say that when I started it, I didn't imagine that it would still even be needed 19 months later, but here we are. I don't know if I'm going to be continuing after this. I've pretty much run out of short fiction. That will change soon, as I've got a bunch of short stories in process. But all the stories that are finished, I've already read on this, as well as my various novellas, like the Corps of Engineers stuff. We'll see. At the very least, I'm going to be taking a break for a little bit once October finishes. But in the meantime, we have October. So my last Starfleet Corps of Engineers story was done in 2006, and it was called Many Splendors. It was the final part of the 6-part What's Past multi-part event, which was done in 2006 as a celebration of Star Trek's 40th anniversary. Simon & Schuster did a lot of things to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the original broadcast of Star Trek back in 1966. They did the Crucible trilogy by David R. George III. There was an anthology called Constellations, and a bunch of other things. And for the S.C.E. series, I decided to do something that would celebrate Star Trek's entire history. So we did 6 stories, all of which was called What's Past, as I said, and all of the stories were basically flashbacks that related to the S.C.E., but also to the greater tapestry of Star Trek. It started with Progress by Terry Osborne, which told a story of Captain Gold and his previous command, the U.S.S. Progress. It also featured Dr. Pulaski from The Next Generation and Sarjenka from the Next Generation episode Pen Pals. Sarjenka would actually become a member of the Da Vinci crew after this. The Future Begins was the story of how Scotty went from herring off in a shuttlecraft in Relics to running the S.C.E., as we saw him there. It also worked in several other of Scotty's appearances in tie-in fiction over the years. And that story featured Admiral Ross, Admiral Nechayev, and Morgan Primus, and Robin Leffler from the New Frontier series, and a bunch of other nifty guest stars. There was Echoes of Coventry by Richard C. White, which was another story of Bart Falwell doing cryptography stuff during the Dominion War. That also featured Marta Botanides, who we saw as a young woman in the TNG episode Tapestry. There was Distant Early Warning by Dayton Ward and Kevin Dillmore, which served as a prequel to the Star Trek Vanguard series. And flashed back to the 23rd Century Corps of Engineers, whom Dayton and Kevin had already done in the Foundations trilogy, as well as the ebook Where Time Stands Still. And it introduced the U.S.S. Lavelle, which was the 23rd century version of the Da Vinci. The Lavelle actually had become supporting characters in the Vanguard series, and Dayton and Kevin used this opportunity to do a little prequel story that helped set the series up. 10 is Better Than 1, which was by Heather Jarman, which gave the origin of showed us in depth the world of Binus, where Solomon comes from, and we find out how the 2 Binars wound up in the S.C.E. And then finally, I did Many Splendors. Many Splendors was the story of the Sonya Gomez-Kieran Duffy romance. We'd established that it happened, and I took advantage of the What's Past storyline to chronicle that romance, and also to do a sort of a lower decks perspective, but I think more accurately to say the engineering crew's perspective on the events of the 2nd through 5th seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation. Starting with Sonya Gomez's arrival, which was established in Q-Who as happening during the events of The Measure of a Man. At the starbase they visited there. They were supposed to be doing crew rotations. I tried to work in as many of the secondary engineer characters that we saw over the course of Next Generation. Most of them only appeared in 1 episode, maybe 2 episodes, but they all show up here, and to sort of, like I said, provide a unique perspective on several of the events of those seasons. So, without further ado, here is Many Splendors by Keith R.A. DeCandido. Chapter 1. Captain's Log. Stardate 42523.7. We are en route to the newly established Starbase 173 for port call. Crew rotation is scheduled, and we will be offloading experiment modules. Ensign Sonya Gomez had been practicing the speech for days. Originally, it was just a speech, one she would give upon meeting her new commanding officer, saying what an honor it was to be serving on her new ship. When she got the word that her request had been approved, and she was to be assigned to the Enterprise, it suddenly became the speech. This wasn't just some old assignment. This was the flagship. She'd be reporting to Lieutenant Geordi LaForge, about whom she'd heard so much from her friend Leon Su, who graduated a year ahead of her and would be her roommate on the ship. Along with another Academy classmate, Ensign Dennis Russell, Sonya had reported to the Enterprise at Starbase 173, and then gone straight to main engineering to meet their new CO. The speech running through her head the entire time she walked through the corridor. She tried to figure out what to do with her hands. Next to her, Denny looked maddeningly calm. LaForge took only a few minutes to introduce himself, show them around, and give them duty assignments. Neither ensign got a chance to say anything. Sorry to cut this short, but I've got a senior staff meeting in a few minutes. Welcome aboard. Despite the hurried nature of the introduction and the terse tone LaForge had throughout, he said the last two words with a genuinely warm smile. With the visor the lieutenant wore covering his eyes, it wasn't easy to judge his mood, but that smile put Sonya at ease. But she hadn't had a chance to give the speech. Worse, she'd studied the engine specs, expecting to be quizzed on them, but LaForge did no such thing. Sonya was assigned to Gamma Shift at first, serving under Esmeralda Clancy. This would give her plenty of chances to show off her knowledge of the Galaxy-class vessel, and get to do it in the lower-key atmosphere of the night shift. The tour ended at the upper core on Deck 31. She and Denny walked down the corridors of the deck toward the turbolift. "You didn't get to give your speech," Denny said with a cheeky grin. "I know. The opportunity never really presented itself." Sonya stifled a yawn. "I need to get some sleep." "What'd you do last night? Or were you up rehearsing the speech?" Sheepishly, Sonya said, "Well, that, and studying the ship's specs. I was up all night." Smirking, Denny shook his head. "Figures." "Denny, I don't want to be—" "I know, Sonya, I know. I was there for your meltdown before finals, remember? Look, it'll be fine." Sonya was already tired of hearing that. "Anyhow," she said after realizing that glaring at Denny was doing no good, "since my shift doesn't start for 8 hours and I was already off kilter from the Starbase's different cycle, I'm going to catch up on my sleep, make sure I'm in good shape for Gamma." Nodding, Denny said, "Sounds vaguely plan-like. I mean, I'm going to see when the holodeck's available. From what I hear, these Galaxy-class ships have state-of-the-art holography, and I've got a great program I want to try out." Remembering Denny's proclivities from the Academy, Sonya said, "Another murder mystery?" Rolling his eyes, Denny said, "Yes, another murder mystery. This one's from New York City in the late 19th century. "What, you're going to solve Jack the Ripper again?" "That was London, and I already did that." Sonya chuckled. She remembered that Denny had reprogrammed one of his endless murder mystery holodeck scenarios so that the person who had solved the Jack the Ripper case was able to reveal that the killer in question was possessed by an interstellar energy creature, as had been revealed by a Starfleet vessel a century earlier. He had said that getting the reactions of 19th century humans accurate had proven challenging. Excuse me," said a voice, and Sonya looked up to see a fellow officer, a junior-grade lieutenant, in fact, wearing the gold of operations and security, coming toward them. He had unkempt brown hair, wide brown eyes, and smile lines around his mouth. I'm running late for a staff meeting." Sonya and Denny stepped aside to let the officer pass. As he did so, he turned and gave Sonya a long look before turning and jogging down the corridor. "Who is that?" Denny shrugged at Sonya's question. "Probably one of the senior staff LaForge was having a meeting with." "Is it my imagination, or was he looking at me funny?" "Maybe, but I wouldn't put too much stock in it. Most people look at you funny." Punching Denny lightly on the shoulder, she smiled, and they continued to the turbolift. Sonya took in her new quarters. They were huge! She had spent most of the last year memorizing everything there was to know about the Enterprise, and had found her quarters without a tour guide or asking the computer. Sonya's sense of direction had become legendary at the Academy. By the middle of her first year, the fourth years were asking her for shortcuts around campus, and she was now confident that just from her intensive study of the ship's specs and diagrams, she could walk from here to the cargo bay with her eyes closed. Even so, even knowing from those specs just how large the quarters she would share with a fellow ensign would be, she wasn't prepared for the massiveness of the space. An advantage of the constant annihilation of matter and antimatter that powered a Starfleet vessel was that it provided energy to spare. One of her Academy professors, upon learning of Sonya's assignment to this ship, had laughed, nodded her head, and said, the Galaxy class, a monument to waste. Having specialized in the study of antimatter, Sonya knew as well as anyone how true that was, but she'd never really thought of it in terms of giving even lowly ensigns on a ship that was 1,000 strong so much room. The quarters included a main room containing 2 desks, a round table, several chairs, and a couch, and a replicator. On either side were 2 smaller rooms. She approached the first and found it filled with an impressive array of Bolian artifacts. Assuming this belonged to Leanne, who'd had a passion for Bolian art for as long as Sonya had known her, Sonya walked over to the other room, which was undecorated, and furnished with a bunk, another desk, and another replicator, as well as a door that she assumed went to the commode. As she had indicated to Denny, ship's time was off a bit from the starbase. She checked the computer station on the desk and saw that Alpha shift had ended a few minutes earlier. Leanne was, like Sonya, on Gamma, serving at ops on the bridge during the night shift, so her roommate's lack of presence here was a bit of a surprise. Leanne and Sonya had shared a plasma physics class a year earlier. Though the former was a year ahead of the latter, they'd become fast friends, and Leanne had continued to write to Sonya from her posting on the Enterprise. Reading of Leanne's adventures and her descriptions of the amazing new Galaxy-class ship, Sonya realized that this ship was where she simply had to be assigned. She'd been driven from the moment she'd first applied to the Academy, but the letters from Leanne made her realize that this was the only place she could possibly go. She realized that catching up on sleep wasn't an option. While she'd made a thorough study of the ship's specs, she still needed to compare that to how the engines were now with the specs it had at Utopia Planitia a year and a half ago. The doors parted with a swish, and Leanne entered. She was rubbing her round face with her hands, her dark curls poorly held in by an attempt at a ponytail. Leanne! Taking her hands away from her face to reveal her large, expressive eyes, Leanne Sue burst into a grin. Sonya, you're here! The 2 friends ran to each other and embraced in a tight hug. Though they'd stayed in touch, they hadn't seen each other since Leanne's graduation a year earlier. It's so great to see you, Sonya said to Leanne's shoulder. I'm so glad we got assigned together. We were lucky, Leanne said. Philo was just promoted to junior grade lieutenant, and she transferred to the starbase. She couldn't handle the pace here all that well. So I had the space, and the quartermaster was kind enough to say yes. They broke the embrace. Leanne reached behind her head and yanked the hair tie out, letting her curls spill loose about her shoulders. Much better. Sorry, I was doing a double shift, and on Alpha I try to keep my hair up. She smirked. Something about the captain being around makes you want to remain tidy. I bet. Why were you doing a double? Commander Data resigned. I couldn't believe it when I heard. Leanne walked over to the replicator. Green tea, hot. The replicator hummed, and a ceramic mug with steam rising from its mouth coalesced into being. She took a quick sip of it, and a transformation came over her. Her eyes brightened, her other features softened, and she seemed to slouch a bit. Much better. Why did Commander Data resign? Isn't he the android? Well, even if he hadn't, I still would have pulled a double. Leanne walked slowly over to the couch. Sonya did likewise. He was being transferred to the starbase so they can experiment on him. Sonya frowned. Experiment? Can they do that to an officer? Shrugging, Leanne said, apparently. Anyhow, Commander Riker didn't have a chance to redo the shift rotation, so he asked me to stay on for Alpha, and I did. We're just orbiting the starbase, so it didn't require a lot of concentration. She took another sip of the tea, then set it down on the table. But enough about me. How are you? Excited. Sonya leaned forward on the couch. I haven't met Ensign Clancy yet. Lieutenant LaForge said I'd be working for her, and I just can't wait to get started when Gamma starts. Good. Leanne stood up. I can take you to 10 forward then. That's the lounge, isn't it? Sonya asked. Leanne nodded. I can't. I've got way too much work to do. Sonya. Also standing, Sonya said, No, I've got to unpack and get ready for the first shift. There's nothing to get ready for, Sonya. I have to make a good impression with Clancy. I don't want her to think I'm just some dumb ensign right out of the academy. I want to show her what I can do. Leanne shook her head. Sonya, you don't have to prove yourself. Yes, I do. You just said your last roommate couldn't handle it. I have to. Look, LaForge is going to be very easy to work for. He's a good officer and a great supervisor. Engineering was a disaster before he got his hands on it. Wasn't he the one in command when you got battle bridge duty that time? Yes. He was excellent under pressure, kept us all focused. She smirked. Well, me and Solus. I think Worf was born focused. Worf is the Klingon? Leanne nodded. He's been in charge of security since Yar died, and it's too bad. She was a good officer. Worf's a little too tightly wound for security. I thought security people had to be tightly wound. Maybe. Leanne shrugged. Anyhow, you should come to 10 forward. Shaking her head quickly, Sonya said, I have to study the ship's engine tonight. You remember what Dr. Rahavray said? She stood up straight and put on the Afrosian's gentle, deep voice. A ship ceases to resemble its blueprints. Leanne joined in, doing an even better impression of their former academy professor. Within the first month of being in space. Sonya, you'll have plenty of time to study it while you work on it. I can't do that. I need to be ready to do this job right now. Letting out a long sigh, Leanne said, You haven't changed a bit, Sonya. She chuckled. No, I take it back. You've gotten worse. Sonya, you're already here. Before Sonya could say anything else, Leanne held up a hand. All right. If you don't want to come, I can't force you, but I need to relax, so I'm going. If you want to join me, just take the turbo lift up one deck, go right, keep on down that corridor until I get to section 2B, make a left, then make an immediate right, go straight until I hit 10 forward. Laughing, Leanne said, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that you already know your way around. We'll talk later, okay? Count on it. Sorry about that. Somebody rang the doorbell and they finally figured out the pause function on this thing. Anyway, where was I? Okay, we'll talk later, okay? Count on it. After Leanne left, Sonya went into her room, stared at her duffel for a moment, then sat at the computer desk and called up the up-to-the-minute specs on the Enterprise's warp core. Leanne had said that engineering had been a mess, tracked with the letters Sonya had been getting. The Enterprise had gone through an unprecedented 4 chief engineers in its first year. With that, the fact that the ship was the first off the line of a new class of vessel, and the types of things that the flagship dealt with on what seemed to be a weekly basis, the engines had probably gone through a lot. She needed to know what the engines were like. She also wondered who that guy was on Deck 31. Chapter 2. Captain's Log, Supplemental. As happened with our sister ship, the Enterprise is beginning to experience a series of systems failures. So far they are random, but I fear there could be early symptoms of what happened to the Yamato. Need some help? Sonya looked up with bleary eyes to see a vaguely familiar officer wearing a junior grade lieutenant's pips on a gold uniform. I'm sorry? I asked if he needed some help. It took Sonya a minute to remember where she was. God, I must have drifted off. I'm sorry, She inhaled through her nose, exhaled through her mouth, a stress reduction technique her sister Belinda had taught her when they were kids, and one that occasionally worked. This was not one of those occasions. She'd worked 2 straight shifts, having come on early during beta shift and worked all the way through Gamma. Ever since downloading the log from their sister ship, the U.S.S. Yamato, which had subsequently exploded, killing all aboard, the Enterprise had been suffering from massive systems failures. LaForge had put her and Clancy in charge of making sure nothing untoward happened with the warp core. It was a catastrophic collapse of the Yamato's warp core that had led to its destruction. Clancy was currently in the upper core, testing the diagnostic systems. Finally, she placed the face of the lieutenant in front of her as the one from Deck 31 on her first day on board. I'm sorry, he said, holding out his hand. Kieran Duffy. I just came on, and Lieutenant LaForge said you could use a hand. You're Clancy? No, Sonya Gomez, she said, returning the handshake. Okay. Sorry, I've been on Alpha and Beta, so I never got to know you Gamma folks. Never much of a night owl myself. He grinned. Not that it matters, since it's always night out here. So, do you? Sonya blinked. I'm sorry? Need help. Oh! Sonya picked up her pad as she found she had no recollection of what she'd just done or what she had to do next. I just ran a diagnostic on the antimatter control systems. They're fine, amazingly enough. Now I have to reset all the control functions on the warp drive, since right now they're reading that the core has been ejected. You sure it hasn't been? Duffy made a show of looking over at the warp core. No, wait, there it is. Okay. Guess we're going to reset it then. Sonya rolled her eyes. Honestly, Lieutenant, I don't. Now it was his turn to blink. Don't what? Need help. I'm perfectly capable of doing this myself. Well, maybe, but the ship's falling apart at the seams, and you've been working for 2 straight shifts. I just got out of bed, so I'm a lot more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed than you. He looked at the top of her head. Okay, maybe with that hair, you're more bushy-tailed, but you get the idea. Lieutenant, look, Lieutenant LaForge ordered me to help you out, and he sort of kind of outranks both of us. For that matter, I technically outrank you, so let's just assume that whole need help thing was rhetorical. What's after the reset on that little list of yours? Sonya stared angrily at Duffy for a second, then finally looked back down at the display on her pad. Make sure the flow regulators are still functioning. Fine, I'll do that. Where did LaForge find this idiot? No, you can't, because you need the computer for that, and I'll be resetting it. Duffy frowned. No, I won't. I can just... Her voice rising, Sonya said, "Lieutenant, you can't check the flow regulator systems if the computer's being reset." Ensign?" Duffy was staring at her with a concerned look. "What?" she snapped. "You didn't say flow regulator systems. You said flow regulators, which I can check by opening up the antimatter housing and taking a gander." "The regulator's completely okay," Sonya said. "I just checked it." She looked down at the pad again. "Half an hour ago. It's the systems." "You didn't say the systems." "Yes, I did." He walked closer to her. He was a lot taller than she, and he was now staring down at her. "Ensign, the word systems never escaped your lips." "Fine, if you say so," Sonya said, though she was sure, absolutely sure, she had said flow regulator systems. "After that is a diagnostic on the containment unit." Sounding almost triumphant, Duffy said, "Which is a separate system in which I can do while you reset the computer." Letting out a long breath, Sonya said, "Whatever you say, Lieutenant." She walked over to the computer and started up the reset sequence. "It can't be the flow regulators anyhow. This is a computer problem, not a mechanical one." Duffy was now standing over at one of the wall consoles and calling up the diagnostic for the containment unit. "Or it's a design flaw." Looking up sharply, Sonya said, "It's not a design flaw." "How do you know? The Galaxy class has only been out for a little over a year. Sure, they ran every possible test on Utopia Planitia, and the shakedown went okay, but a ship this size has got about 1,000 things that can go wrong." "This isn't a design flaw. I've studied this ship from stem to stern, Lieutenant," Sonya said angrily, "and there's no way it's due to a design problem. For one thing, like I said, it's the computer that's having a malfunction. It could be an invasive program, a triblecom." "Oh, come on." Duffy turned away from the containment unit diagnostic to look at her with amusement. "The Enterprise is protected against that kind of thing. Besides, triblecoms don't do this kind of damage. I think you're letting your imagination run away with you, Ensign." Sonya couldn't believe she was listening to this. "I don't have an imagination, Lieutenant," she said before she realized what words were actually escaping her mouth. Duffy burst out laughing. At her aggrieved look, he got control of himself. "I'm sorry, Ensign. That was just too good." "I missed something funny?" Mortified, Sonya whirled around to see Clancy standing behind her. Bad enough this idiot was intruding on her work, now he was making fun of her. Sorry, Ensign Clancy, you're Clancy," Duffy said, stepping around Sonya with his hand out. "I'm Lieutenant Duffy, right." Clancy finished, grasping the lieutenant's hand. "Jordy said you'd be helping out, thanks." "No problem. I'm doing the diagnostic on the containment unit while Ensign Gomez finishes resetting the warp drive controls and checks the flow regulator systems." "Good." Duffy smiled and turned back to the containment unit. Hoping her cheeks weren't turning as red as she feared, Sonya looked down at the display and finished the startup sequence for the reset. Just as she realized what had gone wrong and had lifted her hand to fix it, Clancy said, Sonya, are you sure it's a good idea?" "I know, Ella," Sonya said quickly. She and Clancy had gotten on a first-name basis fairly quickly, especially since it was often just the two of them working together. Sonya had set the entire engineering system to reset, not just the warp core controls. If she'd done that, they'd also lose impulse. At present, they were heading toward some planet or other at sublight, and losing impulse control would be disastrous, especially with everything else going wrong. As she input new commands, she said, "It was a mistake. I'm sorry." "Actually, it was my fault," Duffy said from behind her. "I was distracting the ensign with the joke about the monk, the clone, and the Ferengi. That's why I was laughing. I was trying to get her to laugh, you see." With an amused glance at Sonya, Clancy said, "Doesn't appear to have worked." "No, sir," Sonya said. Then she found herself unable to resist smiling. "I'm afraid I don't find Mr. Duffy at all humorous." "Well, it isn't really that good a joke. Anyhow," Duffy said, "it's all my fault for distracting her. Won't happen again." Clancy nodded. Sonya found herself relaxing for the first time since the Yamato blew up. When Clancy turned her back, she gave Duffy a grateful look for taking the heat. He just gave her a goofy grin in response and got to work on the containment unit. Halfway through Alpha Shift, LaForge had insisted that Clancy and Gomez go off duty. Both women had tried to convince him that they were fine, but when Ella referred to their CO as Falorge, and Sonya found herself incapable of remembering the term warp core, they both agreed that they needed rest. Sonya paused only long enough to do a personal log, during which she found herself saying how cute she thought Kieran Duffy was once she got past his goofball exterior, and then she crashed. Lehan woke her up 10 hours later, at which point it was all over. Sonya walked over to the replicator. "Hot chocolate, please." She turned to Leanne while the replicator hummed with her order. Her roommate was seated on the couch with a green tea cupped in her hands. "What happened?" The hot chocolate materialized and she said, "Thank you," then walked over to join Leanne on the couch. It turned out there was an Iconian computer program in the Yamato's log. It was overriding our computer system. "I knew it!" Sonya said as she sat down. I told him it had to be a tribble-com of some kind. This wasn't just a tribble-com, and who's him? Duffy, a lieutenant from Alpha Shift. LaForge asked him to help me and Ella out. He insisted it was a design flaw. When I told him it was a tribble-com, he laughed at me. Okay, there was something else when I misspoke, but still, he was laughing, the big jerk. And what do you mean it wasn't just a tribble-com? If it was a tribble the size of the moon. This program was rewriting the entire computer system. They finally fixed it by purging the memory and restoring it from the protected archives. Sonya nodded. Makes sense. I think they lost everything from after we downloaded the Yamato log, but... Her eyes wide. Oh, no. Leanne tilted her head. What's wrong? She bounded up from the couch and went over to the terminal, only to see that her personal log wasn't there. In fact, everything after Stardate 42609.1 was gone. Her last 2 personal logs and a log of all the repairs she did on 2.5 shifts. Now I've got to write that all over again. So's everyone else. I wouldn't worry about it. Thinking back over what she wrote in the more recent personal log, she decided it was best. What was I thinking, talking about how someone's cute in a personal log? What if somebody reads that? Shaking it off, she sat back down while Leanne told the rest of the story, about the Romulan ship, the Iconian base they found, and the away team, peculiarly led by Captain Picard himself, and how Data was almost killed by the same program that invaded the Enterprise. Sonya was relieved at that. While she had yet to be formally introduced to the android, she'd seen him in engineering a few times, and had of course heard about the captains defending him on Starbase 173, helping establish the android's sentience, which Sonya had actually thought was a given, though Leanne hadn't. She was glad he won, he was okay, and nobody was seriously hurt. But that's not the really good part, Leanne said with a smile. I've got a date. Sonya blinked. Huh? You know Soon-Tek Han in security? No? Sonya didn't really know any of the other engineers besides Clancy, Duffy, Russell, and LaForge. She had far too much work to do to pay attention to security people. He's very nice, and he's invited me to have dinner with him in 10 Forward tomorrow. Isn't that wonderful? I guess, Sonya said hesitantly. She couldn't imagine the notion of having time to go on a date. She had her duties, and then she spent all her off-duty time going over everything to make sure she hadn't missed something or catching up on the technical journal so she wouldn't lose track of what was going on while she was out here. Or sleeping. Plus, there was always extra work. Geordie LaForge ran an efficient engine room. He had been working with some non-commissioned kid. Leon had said he was the son of the former chief medical officer and was an acting ensign, whatever that meant, due to his great genius, to adjust the deuterium control unit, even though it was well within specified norms. And if he was going to nitpick the engines that much, Sonya had to stay on her toes. The notion of a social life seemed utterly alien to her. Well, I hope you two have fun, she said gamely, wishing the best for her roommate. Thanks. He said he was going to pick the cuisine. Can't wait to see what it is. Sonya smiled, then checked the chronometer and frowned. Ugh, back on shift in 20 minutes. She looked down at herself. I gotta shower and change. Both women rose and moved to their respective bedrooms. I need sleep, Leanne said. Talk to you later, Sonya. Sonya started removing her uniform as she entered her bedroom. Heading toward the commode, she ordered the computer to read her the table of contents from the Journal of Applied Warp Mechanics. The latest issue of JOM had been released the day before, but in the hustle and bustle of the Iconian mess, she hadn't gotten to it. As she showered, she instructed the computer on which articles to flag. She was not going to be caught out without knowing everything. To be continued next week. Thank you very much for watching. You can follow me online at DeCandido.net, read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com. You can find me on Facebook under Keith R.A. DeCandido and like my fan page. You can follow me on Twitter at KRADEC, K-R-A-D-E-C. I'm on Instagram at KRAD418. And you can support my Patreon at patreon.com/KRAD, where I do TV and movie reviews, excerpts from my works in progress, vignettes featuring my original characters, and cat pictures. Lots and lots of cat pictures. Thanks very much, and see you next week. And please, get vaccinated, wear a mask, stay safe.